Welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason, and in today's video, I wanted to do something I promised I would do when I was doing my top 50 players list. Go over my list, try to justify some of the positions of players that I have ranked, and then go over the TSN top 50 list, compare it to my list, what players that are on their list that are not on my list, and vice versa, and also some of the hardest cuts I had to make while making the list. So first, I wanted to go over my list. So I'm not going to go over all of these, obviously, for time's sake, but I just wanted to go over some of my thought process and why I ranked some players where I did. So Zach Claris was the easy one at number one. I don't think anybody else could argue that any other player deserved to be number one in the CFL for the 2023 season. And then at number two was really the hard part. I went with the player that I think is by far the best player at their position in the CFL, and I went with left tackle Stanley Bryant of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. One thing you'll notice right away, a lot of Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the top seven, five of the top seven here. I just think that was just the way it is. I think they just have so many great players, and I think it was justified going into this season to have as many in the top 10 as I did. Eugene Lewis at number three. Easily, in my opinion, the best receiver in the CFL going into this season, so I had to put him up there because it's a passing league. I think it's a position that I value a lot in terms of when I evaluate the Canadian game. So Eugene Lewis at number three made a lot of sense. And then I'm going to skip back all the way to number 8 here. Skip over all the Winnipeg Blue Bombers guys. Brendan Revenberg at number 8 may have been a surprise to many people. I think he ranked like 20-something on the TSN list. We'll get to that in a minute. But Revenberg, a guy I'm extremely high on. I really valued consistency when I was doing this list, so I think that Revenberg is one of the most consistent players in the league. Kind of similar to Stanley Bryant, but he plays the guard position, obviously. And then moving on to number 9, Lorenzo Malden. I didn't give him the number 1 defensive end spot. I gave it to Willie Jefferson, mostly just because he has more of the track record. But Malden had an excellent season last year. You could see 17 sacks, incredible stuff. And then my number 1 ranked running back was Kadeem Carey. Kadeem Carey, as you'll see, is actually higher on the TSN list than it is on my list. And I thought I had him pretty high at number 10. But in my opinion, the best running back in the CFL, unfortunately already injured early on this season. Yeah, that's why I had him at number 10. Just a amazing runner and a guy that's going to break a ton of tackles for you. And then moving on here to number 12, Dalton Schoen of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, a player that I really struggled with where to place because he had only played the one season in the CFL, but had one of the greatest rookie seasons we've ever seen in this league. So I had him at number 12, but I think that in hindsight, I mean, after this season, maybe I look back and he should have been maybe closer to the top 5 because he was one of the best receivers in the CFL last year, arguably the best one, other than maybe Eugene Lewis. So that's where I had Dalton Schoen. Dietrich Nichols was my number 1 defensive back. Derek Dennis, unfortunately, just retired after a surprising release from the Calgary Stampeders. I had him all the way up here in the top 15. Lucky Whitehead, a guy that really surprises you because I actually had him as the highest ranked receiver for the BC Lions. I just think that speed is a differentiating factor, and I think you had 2 years of sample size with him versus not as much consistency with Dominic Rhymes as their other receiver. But Rhymes is a guy I think I had rated a little bit too low when I did this, as you'll see in a second. Olarin Olomolade, already looking like a beast with the Argos through a couple weeks, so I feel pretty good about having him at the number 16 spot. Same with Lanier. Jeffcoat, already injured so far this season. That's been a trend for him throughout his CFL career. Hopefully he can get back on the field soon, but I think maybe I had him a little bit too high, just, looking a couple weeks later with this list. And then I have a couple receivers here, Malik Henry, Tim White, guys that have been number 1 receivers in this league before, but I think that they've looked pretty underwhelming to start the season, so they're not really living up to that top 20 ranking as of now, but I still have confidence that they'll bounce back. Jameer Thurman was one of my highest ranked linebackers. That may have surprised some people. Sean Lemon also was released like Dennis, and he's still looking for a team. He has not officially retired yet. So, anybody looking for a guy that has 92 career sacks should call Lemon up, and maybe he's just waiting for a team to suffer an injury somewhere. Gittins I had very high. I had Gittins above Dominic Rhymes, as you'll see right here, which in hindsight maybe that was an oversight by me, but at the end of the day, that's just my thought process at the time. I thought Curley was the best Canadian receiver in the CFL last season, so he deserved to be ranked pretty high. Haynock Wamba, we'll see in a second that he wasn't on the TSN list. Again, having the Canadian passport plays a factor, and he's been one of the best linebackers in the CFL for a long time now. Obviously was the most outstanding Canadian and the MOP of the Grey Cup last year for Toronto. Jake Merritt, 25, he's my second-rated quarterback here, and this is a big difference between my list and the TSN list you'll see. TSN every year, I always get frustrated where they have many quarterbacks ranked too high. I think that there was really only one deserving quarterback in the top 20 this year, and that's obviously Zach Collaros at number 1. I think there was just such a gap between these guys on paper to begin the year. So Jake Merritt is my second-rated quarterback all the way down at number 25 on the list. I think TSN had about 3 quarterbacks in the top 20, so I think that it wasn't really justified, in my opinion, to have 2 quarterbacks or more in the top 20, so I have Jake here at 25. Jared Davis, looking pretty invisible to start the season, but given the track record, I felt comfortable putting him at numbers 26. Gary Peters has looked excellent throughout the season. Trevor Harris, not too far behind Jake Merritt here as my third quarterback. I think that's pretty well justified. Again, down at 29 on the list. And then down here, you have a trio of Canadians here with Tunde Adeleke, Nick Dembski, and Keon Schaefer-Baker. Tunde Adeleke is my highest-rated Canadian defensive back in the league, one of my highest-rated defensive backs overall in the CFL going into this year. Had a really bad week 1, but still a guy that has a really excellent track record. Nick Dembski and Keon Schaefer-Baker, was really hard to decide between those guys who would be higher. Cameron Judge, a linebacker here, very productive player, but a guy that I think other people probably had higher on their list. And then Jake Serezna, excellent production in only 12 games last year, 10 sacks, 4 forced fumbles in 12 games. He might be higher on other people's lists as well. One guy that stands out here is a Darius Pickett at number 39. I already think I had him too low. Just watching that first game of the season for Toronto, he was all over the place. I didn't really give him enough credit for what he played in Montreal, the role that he played for that defense. So I think that is a huge addition for the Toronto Argonauts, and I already saw that in the first game of the season. And then again with the quarterbacks, I have Bo Levi Mitchell here at 40. Reluctantly put him in the top 50 this year after what we've seen the past couple of years, but just based on track record, again, I had to weigh that a little bit. So I had him in my top 50, but at number 40 on my list. And then trio of Ottawa players here. Carriel Brooks already got injured this season. Sad to see because he has a history of that. But I thought Jarley and Acklin were deserving members of the top 50 list for this year. And then probably the most controversial decision was probably having Dylan Mitchell here at number 50 because he only played half of a CFL season, his first season in the CFL last year, and he has looked underwhelming to start this year. So, we'll see if he can turn that around, but I think that if I was to do this list again, just a couple of weeks later, he may not even be in my top 50 here. So, that's my list, and again, I didn't go over all of them just for time's sake, but those are just some of the controversial decisions and the hardest decisions I had to make when placing these players in order on this list. Okay, now let's take a look at the TSN top 50 list. And again, I'm going to kind of try to breeze through these. So at number 50, they had Jonathan Moxey of the Calgary Stampeders, who didn't make my list at all. I think he is a very talented player, but just hasn't shown enough of a track record, in my opinion, in the league to warrant a spot on my list. So that's why I didn't have him. TJ Lee at number 49. He was number 35 for me, so I was a little bit higher on him. Number 48, running back Brady Oliveira, has looked really good to begin the year. This is another guy that would get some consideration in hindsight from me for my list, but I didn't have him on my final list for the top 50 this year. Dylan Mitchell made TSN's top 50 as well, but again, like I said, he's been underwhelming so far this year. Again, made number 50 on my list. Number 46. This is very interesting because if I was to have a kicker on my list, and this is worth noting as well, for the TSN voters, I think they have to have a certain amount of players for every position, and I think they have to include at least one kicker. So that makes sense why a kicker like Rene Paredes would make the list. Of course, he didn't make my list because I'm not subject to the same requirements that they did. I just didn't think that, there was a kicker worthy of being on the top 50 list this year because there isn't one that really separates from the pack. I think Rene Paredes is probably the closest guy I had to putting on the list from a kicking perspective, but at the end of the day, I didn't have one on my list. Jamarcus Hardrick, almost exactly the same ranking at number 44 on my list, number 45 on theirs. Trey Roberson, again, I haven't seen the track record the last couple of years. A couple years ago in 2019, he was the best corner in the CFL, but has not looked that great since, battled some injuries, so I didn't think he was worthy of a spot on my list. And then Kevin Brown was very close to making my list, running back for the Edmonton Elks, but again, he did not make the final cut for me. Then at number 42, Ja'Garrett Davis, I was significantly higher on him. Javon Santos-Knox, pretty much the same ranking for him. Number 41 on their list, number 46 on mine. Then at number 40, Darius Pickett was around the same ranking that I had at number 39 and number 40 on their list. So not too much of a difference there. It's interesting to see how some of these players, the thinking, the mindset lines up with mine. And then Larry Dean at number 39, a guy that I considered, but I didn't really think he was one of the tougher cuts to make when I was putting together the final top 50. Then at number 38, Malik Henry, I was significantly higher on him. They have him at 38. I have him at 19. I just thought that the speed element, the yards per catch last year was incredibly impressive from Malik Henry. Brought a great skill set to the table, but so far this season, he's looked a little bit underwhelming, so we'll see if he picks it up. And then at number 37, Lucky Whitehead, probably the player that I'm highest on versus the TSN list. They had him at number 37. I had him all the way at number 15. And I think it's just the speed element, similar to what I said about Henry, but Lucky Whitehead even more speed. Just that speed element is something that I just value when I look at CFL receivers, the ability to stretch a defense, be a threat from anywhere on the field. So that's why I had Whitehead so high. And then Sean Oakman at number 36, defensive lineman for the Toronto Argonauts. One of the toughest cuts to make for my list. I just didn't think he was as impactful last year, which is why he didn't make the final cut for me. Tunde Adeleke, around the same ranking as my list. He had him at, or they had him at number 35. I had him at number 30. Nick Dembski, similar thing there, number 31 versus 34. James Butler, I didn't really put a ton of running backs on my list, only two, William Stanback and Kadeem Carey, so that's a big reason why Butler didn't make my list. Jackson Jeffcoat was higher on my list, 18th as opposed to 32 here. Then number 31, Gary Peters. I was a little bit higher on him, but pretty much around the same, 27th and 31 here. And then Jalen Acklin, they're a little bit higher on. I had them at 43. They had him at 30. Jake Mayer, around the same, 25 versus 29 here. Desjardins and Jeremiah Mazzoli, this is a big difference. I did not have Jeremiah Mazzoli on my list, but they have him here at number 27. Again, the overvaluing of the quarterbacks, in my opinion, because I think that there's just not that much of a difference between a lot of these quarterbacks right now around the CFL, besides Zach Collaros at the top and some other guys that are like Trevor Harris that are a little bit more established and don't have the injury concerns that a guy like Jeremiah Mazzoli has or a Bo Levi Mitchell has. So that's why I didn't have Mazzoli on my list. And then at number 26, Derek Dennis, again, cut by the Calgary Stampeders, kind of irrelevant now, but I had him a little bit higher at number 14 as opposed to 26 here. Linebacker Jameer Thurman, I was surprised how high they were on him. I thought I was one of the only people that was super high on him as one of the best linebackers in the game, but I had him at 21, a little bit higher than they have him here at 25. And then Sean McEwen, they were a little bit higher on him than I was. Anthony Lanier, I was a little bit higher on him than they were as well. Brandon Revenberg, I was much higher on him at number 8 versus number 22 for them. I just think the consistency, just something that I valued when I was putting together this list, and the fact that Revenberg's consistently nominated as a CFL All-Star year in, year out, something I valued a lot when putting together the list. At number 21, Curly Gittens Jr., right around where I had him on my list at number 23. Again, Bo Levi Mitchell, quarterback overvalued here at number 20. versus number 40 on my list. I feel pretty good about that because of how Bo Levi started the season here. Hopefully he turns it around for my sake as a Tiger Cats fan, but hasn't looked good, and I feel better than TSN would looking back at this list for having him at number 40 versus number 20 on their list. Mike Rose, I was a little bit higher on. Olarin Olomolade, I was about the same on at number 16. And then Jake Seresna here at 17, a guy that they were actually much higher on than I was. They have him here all the way at 17 versus number 34 for me. So he jumped 17 spots in the ranking to number 17 here. I think that, in my opinion, he was just a guy that needed to show a little bit more sample size. Only played the 12 games last year, but was excellent in those opportunities. Looked good so far this year, so he might be higher on my list next year if we're to do this again. Number 16, Cameron Judge, another guy they're much higher on than I was. I had him at number 33. Judge is an excellent player, not taking anything away from him. I just thought there were players that were more impactful at the linebacking position to put higher. At number 15, Tim White, around the same as I had him. I had him at number 20. They have him a little bit higher here at 15, but can't really argue with that. William Standback, I think, is ranked too high at number 14 versus number 36 is where I had him. Just didn't look very good coming back from that injury last year, so we'll see how he plays the rest of the season, but he didn't look very good the first game of the season for Montreal, so we'll see what happens with him going forward, but I think having him number 14 off that injury he had, not really worth it in my opinion. And then at number 13, again, the quarterback position, a little bit overvalued here. I had Harris at 29. They have him at number 13. I mean, I'm not going to argue too much with this one because Trevor has had a very sustainable track record in the CFL in his career. And then at number 12, Dietrich Nichols, round the same as I had him at number 13. Dominic Rhymes, they're much higher on him. I had him at number 28. They had him at number 11. And I think that this is one that's aging pretty well for the TSN list because I had him, ranked as, like the 7th or 8th receiver in the CFL going into this season. I thought there was going to be a regression there after playing with Nathan O'Rourke last year, but he really hasn't lost a step through the first couple of games of the season, and I would have to have him in the top 20 list if I were to do one right now. And then going into the top 10, not too many surprises up here. So Adam Bighill, Wynton McManus, Kenny Lawler, Lorenzo Malden, Willie Jefferson, Stanley Bryant, Kadeem Carey, Eugene Lewis, Zach Glarus. I had them all in my top 10, but the main difference here is Dalton Schoen, who makes the list at number 5 for them. I had at number 12. Again, I went over that a few minutes ago. I think that maybe if he were to replicate what he did last year, he would definitely be here for me. But I think just having the 1 year of experience in the CFL is why I didn't have him in the top 10 this year. So the final thing I wanted to go over here is the players that made my list but did not make the TSN list. And then I want to go over the other players that were tough to cut when I was making the final top 50. So one player that made my list that did not make the TSN list was the Grey Cup MOP, Henoc Mwamba, who I had all the way at number 24 on my list. I think just with the career he's had, it was justified. The season that he was coming off of, I think he was more than justified as making the top 25 this year, and it was inexcusable of the TSN. A top 50 did not have him in the list altogether. Keon Schaefer-Baker, wide receiver for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, surprisingly did not make the TSN list. That was surprising to me because he is one of those up-and-coming players that can be a guy that could be a number 1 receiver in the CFL. So excited to see what he does going forward. But again, very surprised TSN didn't include him. Luches Purifoy, not super surprised that TSN didn't have him on the list. He's a guy I've always been pretty high on compared to others. So I had him at number 38. Cariel Brooks made my list at number 42 for Ottawa. A guy that struggled with injury, so it's understandable why they would choose another defensive back like Trey Roberson over him to make their list. And at number 45, I had defensive back Richard Leonard. I just think had a really strong year last year for Hamilton, so was deserving to make the list. Number 47, Wesley Sutton, kind of the same deal, was a playmaking machine for Montreal last year, and I thought was deserving of a spot on my list. And then number 48, Simone Lawrence, surprisingly did not make the TSN list because TSN usually values players that have had a sustained track record in the CFL. But at the end of the day, Simone makes my list, but not theirs. And I think that it was just a show of respect why I had him on my list. He barely made the cut. And then finally, at number 49, Michael Couture, offensive lineman for the BC Lions. Not a surprise that he didn't make the TSN top 50 list. Not a guy that gets a lot of attention out there, but a player that I've always appreciated, and he looks great so far for the BC Lions, manning that center position. So those are the players that made my list, but not the TSN top 50. And then finally, let's go over the players that I considered for the list, but ultimately were not that close to making the cut for me. Wide receiver Keon Hatcher for the BC Lions, excellent season last year. If he shows that again this year, I think he has a chance to make the list next year. Suk Chung, I think, had a really good season last year, but I didn't have enough spots for offensive linemen on my list to include him, unfortunately. Linebacker Bo Lacombo, I think that he has looked impressive over his past couple of years in BC. Obviously, the 2021 Most Outstanding Canadian Award winner, but I didn't think he was as impactful last year, and that's why he didn't make my list. And then Sean White and Rene Paredes. If I was to have a kicker on my list, it would have been between these two to choose from here. The two most consistent veteran kickers in the game. Wide receiver Reggie Bagleton. I think if I was to do a top 60, he would have been like 52nd or something like that. He was very close to making the top 50 list for me. Obviously, my number one receiver in the CFL going into last year, had an underwhelming last year and has looked really good to begin this year. So I think that he was one of the tougher cuts for me, but I went with a guy like Dylan Mitchell over him, who was more of an up-and-coming receiver. And then defensive back Titus Wall, an impressive first season in the CFL last year, but not enough of a sample size for me. Running back Kevin Brown, kind of the same thing, but a very promising running back. Again, only had the two running backs on my list. Defensive end AC Leonard, another guy that was close to making the list but had a down last year. Actually led the CFL in sacks in 2021. Running back Jamal Morrow, promising running back, had a great first half of last year, kind of tailed down the stretch. So very interested to see how he does this year. Defensive end Pete Roberson, kind of the same deal, but on the defensive side for Saskatchewan, had an excellent first half of last year, was leading the league in sacks, but had a very poor second half of the season last year. So we'll see how he does next year. Linebacker Larry Dean, talked about him before. He made the TSN top 50 list, so I'm not going to go over him here. Derek Moncrief, surprisingly didn't make either of our lists. But he is a guy that has been one of the most impactful strong side linebackers or cover linebackers in the CFL for a long time now. Hopefully he can stay healthy this year. I think that's been a big concern for him. And then defensive back Nick Marshall is a guy that I did actually consider for the top 50 list. Yes, he gets beaten a ton, but at the end of the day, he does take the ball away at a consistent rate. One of the best playmakers back there at the secondary in the CFL over the past handful of years, but ultimately did not make the final cut for me. Mario Alford, the reigning most outstanding special teams player in the CFL. Again, if I was to include a returner like a kicker on the list, I think that Mario Alford would have made my list. Defensive back Winston Rhodes and Brendan Alexander. These are two guys that probably would have made the list if I would do it after like the 2021 season, but at the end of the day, I don't think they're that, their run of strong play has been that recent. So at the end of the day, that's why they didn't make my list. Janarian Grant, a guy that just had an outstanding kick return last week for Winnipeg. I'm surprised that he wasn't on the TSN list. I'm surprised they didn't include a kick returner on their list. But at the end of the day, I didn't have one on my list either. Running back James Butler is a guy that made the TSN list. Again, I only had the two running backs. Offensive lineman Joe Figueroa. Not enough room for offensive lineman on my list, but he was one of the closest cuts at that position. Devaris Daniels, very solid wide receiver for the Toronto Argonauts. Never has quite reached his potential in terms of production. I don't even think he's had an 1,000-yard season in the CFL, but I think that the talent has always been there for him, and he always makes big plays against the Tiger Cats. Peter Nicastro, excellent rookie season, missed all of last year for Toronto. Probably on the list next year as one of the bright young offensive linemen in the game. And then defensive lineman Sean Oakman, one of the toughest cuts for me because he had a really strong 2021 season, but not as strong of a 2022 season. So that's why he didn't make my list. And then Jeremiah Mazzoli, some injury concerns with him. Otherwise, he probably would have made the back end of my list. Defensive back Brandon Dendridge has played pretty well over the past couple of years with Ottawa. Thought he was worthy of a mention. Kick returner Devontae Dedmon has not looked like the dynamic returner that we saw the first 20 games or so of his CFL career in a while now, but at the end of the day, still a threat to break one and take one to the house on any given play. And then going on to the Montreal selections here, Greg Ellingson didn't make my list. One of the most consistent CFL players over the last decade or so, but has struggled with injuries over the past couple of years since coming back from that canceled season. So that's why he didn't make my list. Defensive back Marc-Antoine Dequoy could very well make this list next year as an up-and-coming defensive back. Maybe he takes that best Canadian defensive back in the league title away from Tunde Adeleke of the Hamilton Tiger Cats, but for now, I didn't have him on my top 50. And then the final guy that deserves a mention here is kick returner Chandler Worthy for the Montreal Alouettes, the runner-up for Special Teams Player of the Year to Mario Alford last year. So these are just the guys that I considered for the list. Some of them got more consideration than others, but ultimately I considered all of them for the top 50, and they deserve a mention here. But with that said, that is going to be the end of today's video, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate anybody who stuck around to watch the whole thing. I know it was pretty long and probably pretty boring throughout some parts, but at the end of the day, those are just my selections for the top 50 players list for this year and TSN's list. Hope you guys enjoyed the little comparison that I did. Be sure to let me know your thoughts about the placements of players on each list. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.